You see it now?
Mm-mm.
Okay, let's try that one more time.
Yeah, great. All right, welcome everyone to our little lecture series here today by Ms. Moore White and myself, Ms. Lopez. The title of today is LA, Los Angeles, an ode to our Black and Brown city. So again, my name is Ms. Lopez. Some of you I've taught over the last few years. Some of you we've met maybe walking across the hallways. Some of you maybe we've never met. Nice to meet you. I am a history teacher in the fourth floor King Drew. I was also once a King Drew student, born and raised in South LA, South Bay area. Right? I attended King Drew. I attended Gardena High School. I attended Washington Prep High School. This is my community, and I came back to teach here knowing that I wanted to share that story about where I come from and how it shapes who I'm gonna be as a teacher, how I'm gonna contribute to society. I also want to throw out that I am a Latinx and Indigenous, right, from Guatemala. My family and my peoples are from Guatemala, and that also very much shapes who I am as a person, as a community member here in Los Angeles, and hopefully that shapes for you a reflection of how you can contribute to your society, learning from history.
All right, and good morning or good day, everyone. My name is Miss Moore White. Like Miss Lopez, I was also a former King Drew student. I graduated class of 2008, and I also grew up in the community. So my family's roots in Los Angeles start in Watts, and after that, my grandparents on my dad's side bought a house on 120th in Vermont, very close to that Ralph's grocery store that I'm sure a lot of you guys grew up seeing. And then my mom's parents bought a house in Carson. Actually, they bought a house in Gardena because it was Gardena. It was actually Carson before it was actually Gardena before it was Carson, excuse me. And so I grew up kind of mostly in the South Bay. I went to elementary school in Carson. I went to middle school in Palos Verdes. And, you know, my experience in my middle school definitely left me wanting for more. I only had one African-American teacher my whole time in middle school. And so I was like, you know, when I pick a high school, I definitely want to go to a magnet school, but I also want to go to a magnet school that looks like me and is reflective of myself. So I intentionally chose to go to King Drew. And it was one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life. So just going straight down the street from 120th in Vermont to 120th in Compton literally changed the trajectory and the course of my life. And I'm so thankful for King Drew. All right, so Ms. Lopez, you ready to get started?
Yeah. I just, as you were sharing your story, Miss Morwhite, I'm thinking about when you and I were high school students at King Drew. We probably like walked next to each other and we saw each other and we were going to our classes, and how that again shapes who we are as teachers and what we're going to share with you today with goals and objectives. um yeah, let's go to our goals and objectives for these sessions. So essential question, this is a question that I hope together we get to answer throughout this lecture, throughout every slide that you hear, and even after this. But I want you to think about this question of why should we learn our Los Angeles history, and how does that empower us? Okay, why should we learn this history and how does that empower us?
All right, so when we think about it, so we want you to, after going through this lecture, we want to be empowering students as active community participants through learning about their communities and cities, regardless of their demographics. So it doesn't matter what your skin color is, whether you're Black, you're brown, you're Indigenous, you're Asian. It doesn't matter whether you are male, female, non-binary, if you're a part of the LGBTQ community, it doesn't matter. We want you to be able to see yourself in Los Angeles history and know that you have a place and know that you have a role, and just understand that you, in fact, are here. Or and have been here, and your family has been here, or cultures like yours have been here for generations and for centuries. And also, we just know that we're living through a pandemic. And so sometimes it's hard to connect with your teachers, with your classes, with everything. So just having the ability to kind of see yourself is incredibly important. And so a lot of people in here are part of the careers program. So understanding even the careers program's role in King Drew's development and your role as well in the history of that. The second thing that we want you all to see is that we want you to be analyzing the historical and material context of our communities and their leaders. So oftentimes, important history is right in front of you, and sometimes you're not paying attention to it, and you don't even know that, hey, the things that are important to me or that look like me are kind of in plain sight, but they're being hidden for whatever reason. So this time, we're going to open some of those doors and show you some things that maybe you hadn't thought about, maybe you hadn't seen before.
Yeah. And our third point here, centering the experiences of Black, African American, Brown, Indigenous people of Los Angeles in our historical memory. You're going to see this term BIPOC throughout the lecture, and you're going to see us hear us say it. This stands for Black, Indigenous people of color. So one thing that Ms. White and I want you to know, well, we're really excited to teach you this, but we also reflect upon this, what happened to us. Ms. White, you and I didn't learn this history till we were in our 20s, probably. We were in college learning this history about our communities, and how we have been a part of building that towards what we are today. Now, we wanted to gift you that and give you that and say, look, we want to teach you right now. It's okay for you to learn this later on in your life, but how amazing would it be for you to learn this now? Because this is going to be your grounding. This is going to be your foundation for when those days are tough, for when that homework is really hard, for when things are difficult. You get to go back to your historical memory and say, no, I know my people are resilient. I know we've built a city, a town, communities. And now you get to do that with the history that you learn. We're also in a pandemic. Ms. White, do you want to share a little bit about what it's like to learn this? Now we're in the middle of a pandemic.
You know, I actually wanted to kind of piggyback off of what you just said in terms of learning your history. It is like super important to be able to kind of rest on our community's strength. So often we hear about the traumas or the negative things that happen in our Black and Brown neighborhoods, but we want to show you that, hey, there's benefits, there's positives, there's joy here. And so that you can rest on that and propel and catapult yourself into the future. As Ms. Lopez said, having a connection to your roots, even though sometimes our roots may seem a little bit blurred.
Yeah. And as we think about all of that, the resilience, the joy, Ms. White and I recognize that COVID-19 is happening. A lot of us are affected by the pandemic, and it's hard sometimes to learn or to sit and be in class for X amount of hours while we have things going on. We wanted to give you this day, and this lecture is a time to reflect on and learn about the resilience and the strength and how we've built this city as a form of just taking a step back, taking a deep breath and learning from us and learning with each other about this history so that we can get stronger and stronger as a community. All right, Indigenous history. Indigenous. This term is a term that can also be used with Native Americans here in North America. And every time I teach, I think it's super important to recognize and honor the Indigenous people of a territory or land. This idea of, oh, we discovered a land is not real, because there have been people in this land for thousands of years, right? People have been here in this land. Land was not just discovered. Specifically here in Los Angeles, if you look at this map right here, the mouse is going towards that circle, that red circle, that's Los Angeles. Right now, if you are in LA County, sitting down right now, you are in Tongva land. You are in Tongva territory. And I invite you to always honor that. As you're learning history, as you're walking the streets thinking, wow, Indigenous people were here before me and this is their land. Now we know that the Spanish came, right? California used to be Mexico, and they decided to rename the Tongva people to Gabrieleño Tongva tribe. And we will share a resource sheet after this, which will have links and information on some of these articles and this map, so you can look around if you're in another state or somewhere else, who are the Indigenous people of this territory. As again, you're walking, you're stepping out, you might be driving around. I want you to think about geography. Some of the major streets and routes and freeways today are also routes that indigenous people use. For example, the 405 freeway, if you were to travel towards UCLA, towards West Los Angeles, that freeway, before it was a freeway, was a trade route for the Tongva people. And then as colonization happened, the Europeans came and obviously took over the territory, hurt many indigenous people, genocide happened, and that created that freeway. But when you're driving on the 405, I want you to think, wow, this was a trade route for indigenous people.
And the same thing with the 110 freeway as well. So the 110 freeway was originally a trade route. And then over time, as more European Americans came into California, they overtook that and turned it into the 110 freeway that we now know, and that runs very close to where a lot of you all live, and King Drew as well.
Yeah, the 110 is really close to a lot of us. So then what happens, right? We look at this map down here that says land claims by tribe, Native American lands. We see that the English are traveling this way, are colonizing the people from East Coast to West Coast. We see the Spanish are coming up. So indigenous peoples are losing their land. But what happens to indigenous people? Indigenous people through genocide and colonization and missions. Maybe you have heard of missions. Maybe you learned about them in elementary school and fourth grade. Maybe you built a mission, right? Like the San Gabriel mission. Well, those were actually institutes and institutions to colonize, enslave, and Christianize Native Americans. And through that hurt and pain, many Native Americans either lost their culture or were died and were murdered through genocide. But that does not mean indigenous people no longer exist. If you look at the bottom right corner right here, we see Tongva Land Forever, the true first citizens of Los Angeles. This is an article of these young people who are currently, they are Tongva descendants, they are Tongva people who still exist today and are saying, hey, remember us, this is our land. Now, the California jurisdiction of 1928, this is important. In the 1800s, the United States and these other European colonizers are coming and are saying, you know what, Native American tribes, we're going to take your land, but we'll give you little pieces. Here, you could have this little piece. Let's sign an agreement. Those agreements are called treaties. You sign an agreement, right? Well, in the late 1800s, California all of a sudden tells the Tongva people, because the Tongva people are telling them, hey, we have people that are called squatters taking over our land. We have people that are coming and taking over our land, but we have an agreement. So why are they still coming? Well, California says, my bad, we lost those treaties. So we can't find those treaties. I don't know where the paperwork is at, right? This is before technology, before all of this. They lose these treaties. But in 1928, all of a sudden, a reporter and a researcher finds these quote unquote lost treaties. And the Tongva people find out about this, and Tongva people are saying, well, you need to give us our land back. So then that sparks this big discussion that still happens today. What is reparations? How do we help? How do we contribute and give back to the indigenous community when essentially through lost treaties, their land was stolen? And that's some of the land that we still sit on today. Well, I want you to think about, again, that question that we started with. Why should we learn our LA history? How does that empower us? I want you to also think about everywhere you go, there have been indigenous people of that land. Who are they, and how is that important to empower us as well? Formative wars. All right, so let's look at this map. Some of us have been studying a little bit of this map, and we're gonna talk a little bit more about it. But before that, I want us to think about acknowledging borders. When I say the word borders, specifically our generations that have been born and hearing these political discussions over the last 4 8 years, you might think walls, right? You might think a border specifically between Mexico and the United States, right? There have been tensions there. Well, I want you to know that borders are imaginary. Okay, well, we'll talk more about that. They're almost always man-made and arbitrary. Borders have been used as a tool of colonization. Borders as we know them now, they weren't real in that same way for Native and indigenous people in the Americas. They didn't have walls. They didn't say, give me your paperwork, you can't come into this territory. That's not how they live. Indigenous people had open trade route lands where you can go ahead and travel into other territories. Of course, you communicate with the other nations, but it was not the way that we know it now. Now, these borders that we know now in the 1900s have sparked a lot of tensions and wars. And that's going to lead us to the Mexican-American War.
All right, so we're going to talk about three wars that were really important for the formation of the United States and eventually the formation of California and Los Angeles. So we have the Mexican American War that happens between 1846 and 1848. So Mexico realized that their northern territory really didn't have a lot of people on it. And they said, hey, if we don't get this area populated very, very soon, we're going to lose this land to the United States that's rapidly expanding with their manifest destiny plan. So they're going to say, hey, a lot of the immigrants coming into the United States during this time period are Catholic. How about we invite people who are Catholic, who possibly want to learn Spanish, and who definitely do not want to have slavery, because Mexico had outlawed slavery in the early 1800s. So, unfortunately for Mexico, the people who came, they weren't Catholic. They refused to learn Spanish, and they wanted to bring their slaves with them. So within maybe less than 10 years of these new settlers coming in, they're going to create a war and start the Mexican American War. And as I said previously, Mexico does not have the resources or the people to really protect this land. And unfortunately, they're going to lose it. And the ironic thing about that is that once these new American settlers came and took over this Mexican land, they forced the former Mexican citizens to either learn English or to go back into go south into Mexico. And so we're going to see that the U.S. is going to expand. We're going to see New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, parts of Utah, and also parts of Colorado be expanded and added to the U.S. and really give it that sea to shining sea type of feeling for our country.
And I do understand that some of us here may be world history, US history students, different grades that were watching this. So I want us to look at this map very closely, especially as Ms. Morway was talking about the Mexican American War, this top right corner here. Mexico, right, is pushing back towards the United States. And one of those reasons is also slavery. Mexico and slavery before the United States. Yes, there was slavery of African peoples in Mexico. Know that, remember that. And they end slavery before the United States. Well, this discussion and conversation and debate about slavery is happening in the United States in the 1860s. We have the Union up here. We have the blue states in the northern part of the United States. Yep. And then in the southern states, we have the Confederacy, the red states. Okay. The Union and the Confederacy both wanted California support, but for different reasons. Again, we're thinking about LA, California. How does California play into this? Well, the Union, the blue states were saying, let's get California. The gold rush is just happening. Let's get some money. Let's get some trains out there. Let's connect, right? Without slavery. But the red states, what do you think the red states are saying? The red states are saying, no, we want California and Nevada and Oregon because we want to have slavery there. We want to have more property and land so we can enslave people and profit there. Well, the Civil War was won by the blue states, by the Union, and California was added as a state to the United States as a non-slave state. So slavery no longer existed, did not exist in California. Slavery ended. So how does that shape what California looks like today, Ms. Morway? What's happening here?
So the really interesting thing that a lot of people don't realize is that there are actual Civil War forts in Los Angeles. So right, like super close to us in Wilmington, California, we have what's called a drum barrack. A drum barrack essentially held a lot of the weapons. So there was a fear that the Confederate states were going to make their way all the way into California and take over California. The Union didn't want that, so they built forts along the way to protect California. So that drum barrack is gigantic, 63 acres, is about 19 buildings. It's now utilized as the Civil War Museum for Southern California. So at some point in time, we should all check that out and see what's in there and see how California connects to Civil War history. So the last war that I want to talk about is going to be the Spanish-American War of 1898. Now, this war doesn't really take place in mainland North America. It takes place in Cuba, but the ramifications of the war are what are really important to the US. So we're going to see that Spain is going to spend most of their resources when they have access to North America. They're going to spend most of their time, as Ms. Lopez has said previously, Christianizing or trying to spread Catholicism throughout North America. So they're going to be successful in that, but they're not going to be successful in really making any money off of North America. They don't understand how to extract the mineral or natural resources like the oil, like the gold, like things like that. So what we're going to see, they're going to get into a war or a battle over Cuba, one of their last little pieces in North America. Well, because they're already on the way out of North America, they're not strong enough to resist the United States. It's going to cause them to, when they lose the war, it's going to cause them to lose all access essentially to all of their North American property and territory, which essentially ensures that the United States isn't going to be challenged by any other European nation, that they can pretty much control the most populous and the most powerful part of North America. And so the last thing that I want to highlight is the Black and Brown histories of all of the soldiers included in these wars. So whether we're talking about the Mexican-American War, the Civil War, or the Spanish-American War, you're going to see high populations of Indigenous and Black and Brown people who are included as soldiers. And unfortunately, they're going to essentially just be used to further someone else's mission. And whenever these Black and Brown soldiers get captured, unfortunately, they're usually slaughtered and there's no repercussions, nothing that comes back to the groups that slaughtered them. And that's unfortunately what happens throughout a lot of these early wars in American history. All right, so you all will notice that with this PowerPoint, we're going out and then we're coming in slowly but surely. So we've talked about the Indigenous history. We've talked about the US history. So you know what comes next? California, right? So there's a lot of interesting things about California. So one of the first things, I didn't know California history really in depth until I was like in my 20s, until I had gone to college, until I was actually paying for school and paying to get this understanding and information. So the most interesting thing to me is, what's California named after? How did it get that name? It's interesting. So there's a book, all right? The book comes out in, I think, the early 1300s, and it's called Las Surgas de Esplandian, or The Adventures of Esplandian. So it's by Garci Rodriguez de Montalvo. And so it's a fictitious novel, and it talks about this guy coming across an island. And when he comes across this island, the island is not named California. And the island has nothing but Black women. And it's led by a queen, and her name is Queen Califia. So I had no idea that California was named after an island of Black women. Because back in California's early history, or the early map making history, people believed that California was an island. It's not, obviously, but that was the belief back then. And so California is actually named after an island of Black women. And so, as I said, so we're going to talk about California a little bit. So I said previously that when Mexico had control over California, it was not very populated. It did not have a huge population of people. And in fact, up until the mid 1800s, California's population was dominated predominantly by Indigenous people. You're going to have about 100,000 Indigenous people and about 800 European Americans. That's it. But then magic happens. Someone discovers gold, and that causes the gold rush and the gold boom to happen. So within 2 to 3 years, you're going to see the Native American population is going to decrease significantly. A lot of times due to violence, but also you have 100,000 European Americans making their way west. And when they come, they're going to bring some interesting attitudes. So in the early gold rush, well, it's interesting. There's one thing you're not going to see in the gold rush. That's Black people. Because if you know the gold rush time in the late 1840s, slavery is still happening in the United States. So therefore, there are no Black people who are able to get rich off the gold rush. But also, you're going to see that originally there are going to be Chinese people who are able to come into California and make some money. There's even going to be some Mexican Americans, some Mexicans who are able to come into California and make some money as well. Because at this point, we're still in Mexico. We're not even in California yet when this all officially happens. But over time, as these European Americans come in, they're going to bring some negative ideas and attitudes. They're going to be anti-immigrant. They're going to be anti-Mexican. And they're going to prohibit by law Chinese people and Mexican American people from even joining into the gold rush. So what that's going to lead to is that these populations are going to be on the periphery or on the outside of the gold rush. They're going to be able to give people supplies, but not actually make money off of the gold. So if you're Chinese, For the most part, you're going to get into the supply industry. You're going to supply the tools that are needed to prospect or to mine for gold. If you're Mexican American, for the most part, you're going to be utilized for your agricultural services. So as the population grows in California, you have more need for food. So they're going to utilize the Mexican labor for their food needs. And so it's interesting how you see BIPOC people essentially excluded from even prospecting or getting access to any of that wealth. And so sometimes you have to understand some of that history that's right in front of you, or sometimes the history that's hidden from you. So sometimes we get a history in our books that is usually a bit more Eurocentric, and it almost makes you feel like Black and brown people were not alive and not around when these things were happening. Well, guess what? They were, and we want to show them to you as well. All right, so as I said previously, Ms. Lopez, do you want to jump in on anything for this part? Good. All right, she's good. All right, so let's move on a little bit further. So we jumped from the US, we went to California. So that means our favorite place, at least my favorite place, is coming up, Los Angeles. Okay. So Los Angeles's origins. Now, a lot of this stuff, honestly, I didn't learn until recently, which I think is absolutely crazy that we live in Los Angeles, we grow up in Los Angeles, and sometimes we don't see the history that's directly in front of us. So the original founding families, there's going to be 11 original founding families of Los Angeles. So of those 11 original founding families, 9 of them are going to identify as BIPOC. So you're going to have Native American families. You're going to have Black families. You're going to have mulatto families. Mulatto is a mixing of Black and white. You're going to have mestizo families. And mestizo is going to be a mixture of indigenous populations as well as European or Spanish ancestry. And then down here, you have 2 additional families that are Spanish. But so the Spain that I think of now, so Spain is in Europe, so hopefully we all know that. So the Spain that I think of now is not the Spain that was happening in the early 1700s when these people are going to be coming into Los Angeles. So the Spain of that time is going to have a lot of African influences. So it's not so far-fetched to say that these 2 Spanish families actually probably were a bit more multicultural. And so I personally didn't know that the original founding families of Los Angeles looked like Miss Lopez and myself. I didn't, or a combination of Miss Lopez and myself, okay? And so also, what's the name of LA? So we have like LA, the city of angels, Los Angeles. What's the full name of Los Angeles? So the full name, El Pueblo de Nuestra Señora la Reina de Los Angeles de Porciuncula, the town of Our Lady, the Queen of the Angels of Porciuncula, which is founded in 1781. So understanding the full name of Los Angeles, not just the city of angels, it has more parts to it than that. All right, so Ms. Lopez, do you want to jump in and talk about this for a second?
Yeah, so that's still officially the name of Los Angeles. If you go to downtown LA, you'll still see this name in certain areas. Porciuncula is a very famous river in Mexico. So that's why the people brought that name here. I want us to look at this chart, Ms. Moore White, that you were talking to us about the 11 original families. When you look at birthplace, that location that says birthplace, some of you all may have Mexican descendants, are Mexican or are Mexican American. I want you to know the families that founded Los Angeles come from places like Nayarit, Sinaloa, Jalisco, Durango, Cadiz, Chihuahua. You may still hear some names. And I think it's really interesting to make those connections like, wow, the families that founded Los Angeles were possibly from locations that some of my family are from. I'm not Mexican, but if you are Mexican, that would be something that you would be thinking about. So I wanted you to take a look at that people from Sinaloa, from Nayarit, from Jalisco, Durango, Chihuahua were all the founders of Los Angeles.
Okay. All right. So I had mentioned previously that during the gold rush, we're going to see a large population of European Americans overtake the Native American population. So how did Los Angeles end up becoming the multicultural place that we know it as today? Well, I have to essentially go back to war. So between 1910 and 1970, the US was involved in a lot of wars. We have World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and also the Vietnam conflict. So what that means is the US is going to have a high need for labor, people to produce parts, to produce weapons, to produce things like that. And unfortunately, they're not going to have enough European Americans to fulfill all those jobs. So they're going to look to the South and they're going to look to Mexico to fulfill those jobs. So before 1910, for the most part, the majority of African Americans in the United States are going to live in the South. And they're going to essentially be forced to stay there because of the labor needs that the South has. They're not going to let people leave. But after these wars start between 1910 and 1970, well, now the East Coast, the North, and eventually the West Coast are going to need African Americans. So you're going to see about 6 million African Americans leave or flee the South during this time period. And then at the same time, you're going to have a huge push for a lot of Central American nations to also send their immigrants to help with the labor needs, including Mexico, Guatemala, the Dominican, and so many other Central American nations as well. And so that big push for immigration and for people is what helps to get people into Los Angeles. And so there's historical terms that I want to talk about called push and pull factors. So a push factor in general is going to be a negative thing. It's going to push you out of your homeland and out of where you're comfortable living. And it's usually going to be violence. So that can be in the Black community in the South. Unfortunately, there was a lot of violence against African Americans. In certain Central American countries, there was a lot of violence as well. So that's going to push people out. But also not having access to good schools, not having access to healthcare, not having access to opportunities and resources. All of those things are also going to push people out. But then we have the reverse of that. That's called a pull factor. It's going to pull you in. Usually that's going to be a positive. It's going to be the flip of whatever is happening negatively. So you're going to have maybe a more peaceful society, having access to schools, having access to healthcare, having access to really vital services. And those are going to pull you into a new place. Ms. Lopez?
Yeah, I want us to think about, again, bringing us to the present, connecting the history. Los Angeles today, the population today is still shaped by push and pull factors. People are still being pushed from their countries and are being pulled into cities like Los Angeles. And my family would be an example of that. In the 80s and 90s, my family from Guatemala were pushed out from Guatemala, outside of Guatemala, because of a civil war, because of violence, and they were pulled by jobs, access to education, and whatnot. If it wasn't for those push and pull factors, Ms. Lopez would not be here. Ms. Lopez would probably be in Guatemala, be a teacher in Guatemala. I would have been raised over there, right? So knowing that those push and pull factors still are shaping Los Angeles today and what it looks like.
And definitely, I agree with you 100% on that. My family was also shaped by push and pull factors. My mom's family directly came from Memphis, Tennessee because of violence. And so had it not been for some of the violence that was happening in the South, I would not be here. I'd probably be in the South with a very heavy Southern accent. All right, so let's move on to, go ahead, Ms. Lopez.
Yeah. Early Black and brown figures. So Ms. Lopez, me, Ms. Moore White, and I, we've been talking about this lecture, right? We've been talking about how we've learned a lot of the pain, violence, and hardships that our communities go through. But we also want you to know about the resilience. We also want you to know about who have the people that have been creating our city, have taken in spite of all of those hardships and built great things. One of those peoples is Pio Pico. You might know Pico Boulevard, or you may have heard of that street. This man he was Black, Native American, and Spanish. He was one of the wealthiest men in California. All of this happening in the late 1800s. And he's a governor entirely of California, while Mexico is still here. So California is Mexico, and we have this man who's Black, Native American, and Spanish, who's the governor of the entire state. Anything you want to add on to that, Ms. Marwhite?
Yeah, and so it's quite interesting too. So those 11 founding families of Los Angeles he has a direct line to one of those families. And it's quite interesting because he amasses so much wealth and so much land that literally the land that he's able to sell off helps to create a lot of the surrounding cities that we now know in Los Angeles. So he was a very incredibly powerful and incredibly wealthy a black and brown person in early Los Angeles history. And in fact, the last black and brown mayor or governor, excuse me, of California.
Yeah, imagine how many years it's been for him to be the last black and brown mayor of California. Biddy Mason. Let's talk a little bit about Biddy Mason. She is a former slave from Georgia, is brought to California as a slave to San Bernardino, but then remember California is added into the United States as a union and then becomes a free state, so she gets her freedom. Here in Los Angeles, she comes and becomes a very famous and popular healer and nurse for both Black and Brown communities. She teaches herself how to speak Spanish and English fluently so that she can talk to all the Latinx, Mexican American, Indigenous people that were here, and becomes a very famous healer. She is also the first Black woman to own land here in Los Angeles, and she owned a lot of it.
Yes, she's going to own most of downtown Los Angeles. So there's a park. It's actually called Biddy Mason Park, and it actually starts at the land that she first bought. It's on Spring Street in downtown Los Angeles between 3rd and 4th Street. So that's her original plot of land. And then she ends up expanding that to control most of downtown Los Angeles. And so not only does she have history because she's the first Black woman to own land in Los Angeles, but she also helped with eventually civil rights history later on. So, and religious history as well. So she gave the land for a very important church in the African American community called the First African American Methodist Episcopalian Church. And so that church was started in the early 1900s, and it was utilized during the civil rights movement to propel a lot of civil rights thoughts and eventually help to increase the civil rights of Black people, but eventually all other BIPOC groups in the United States. So once again, just understanding that Biddy Mason, and actually before she died, she amassed about $6 million worth of wealth. It probably ended up being a lot more than that because that land in downtown is worth billions of dollars now. So just to understand that you had a Black woman who controlled the majority of downtown Los Angeles is very important as well.
Yes. All right. So as we're getting to the conclusion of this lecture for you, I want you to look at this map and I want you to think about, all right, we learned about California, Los Angeles, Indigenous peoples, Black people, Latinx people. And I want you to think about being mindful as you step out from your house today, you go out in the street or you go on a drive and wonder, why are the names that are there, right? These questions of, do you know your cross street names, and why should we learn about the legacy in naming streets in our communities? Here we see King Drew. It says temporarily closed, sad face, but let's imagine we're at King Drew right now. We're in the lecture hall, right? Or the oral arts room, and we go outside and we step outside and we see 120th and Compton. Why is Compton named Compton? Where does that name come from? And how is that saving or preserving someone's legacy? And I want you to think about that as you step out and look at Vermont. Why is Vermont called Vermont? Normandy. Why is Alvarado called Alvarado Street? Why is San Pedro? San Pedro is St. Peter in English. Why is it called that? So your kind of mindfulness moment that we want you to take out is, as you step out today, look at the cross streets around you and say, why is it called that street? Why is it called that name? Where does that name come from? So that when we continue with this conversation, you get a little bit more sense of your community and what the history is there. And again, how you get to shape that history.
All right, so what's coming up next? All right, so up next is all about location. So location, location, location. So why are we here and what's around us? You ever notice that in your neighborhood, like everyone looks like you? Is that intentional? Is that planned? Why is that? And then also, why are there certain structures in our neighborhood that maybe aren't found in more affluent areas? Why are there freeways that pretty much only go through the hoods in Los Angeles? So we're going to talk about those things and think about those things and just really understand our placement and our proximity to everything happening in Los Angeles. After that, one of my favorite things to talk about. How did we get to King Drew? Like, what led us to this place? What historical events? What people? What migratory patterns? What things led us to go to King Drew, or even start and create King Drew? And why is it important to know all that stuff about your history and about your school and about your culture and about your heritage? All right. And then also resiliency. So, as much as we talk about the traumas and the negatives and the bad things that happen, we have to talk about the joys. And there's something about our communities that we're still able to smile and dance and laugh and really just show the greatness in our communities. And just focusing on some of those people like Miss Lopez and myself, who had a chance to leave the hood and not come back, but intentionally chose to focus in on a place that poured so much into us. So we're going to find people who poured into the hood, that made them and created them. And we're going to talk about their resiliencies, their joys, the things that make them who they are in spite of all the things that happen in our communities. All right, so thank you to everyone. And I want you all to just check out the Watts Towers, which is incredibly close to King Drew. And hopefully some of you all may have seen that. Same thing that's on my t-shirt right now. So hopefully you all have a wonderful session, and we're going to stop the recording now. So thank you. And hold on, let's get to it. We're almost got one more thing to do. You ready, Miss Lopez?
Yeah, we're gonna have a little sing dance you out. We hope that you have a good weekend. Let's do this. All right, everyone. If you could get some cameras on to say goodbye to us, that'd be great.